The bread was still warm. Lottie could feel it through the rough linen of her apron pocket. A small, dense loaf, barely the size of her fist, tucked against her hip like a secret she was carrying with both hands cupped around it. She walked fast, her boots cutting through the frozen mud of the servants' corridor, keeping her head down, her shoulders curved inward as if she could make herself smaller than she already was. The kitchens of Veldrath Keep were loud at this hour. Steam rolled from copper pots. The smell of roasting meat and burnt herbs thickened the air, and the head cook, a broad woman named Marta, was shouting at two boys about improperly salted broth. No one looked at Lottie. They never did. She was the girl who mopped the stone floors before dawn, who swept ash from the great hearths, who carried water from the well in buckets so heavy her shoulders had stopped aching from them years ago. Invisible. That was how she survived in a place like this. She slipped through the side door. The cold hit her like a wall. Outside, the night was sharp and moonless, the sky a bruised gray smeared with the first suggestion of snow. Wind moved through the pine trees at the far end of the yard, and the torches along the keep's outer wall bent sideways in their iron brackets. Lottie pulled her shawl tighter, a thin, fraying thing the color of old ash, and pressed the bread harder against her hip. Just get home. Just get there. She crossed the yard, past the stable where the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, past the woodpile stacked against the stone wall, past the iron gate that separated the keep's grounds from the village path. The gate was unlocked at this hour. That was the one mercy the night offered. She pulled it open, slipped through, and started down the hill. The village of Veldrath sat below the keep like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten, a scattering of low timber houses, most of them dark now, their shutters closed against the cold. Smoke rose from 2 or 3 chimneys. The path down was slick with ice, and Lottie took it carefully. One hand braced against the stone wall that bordered it, the other pressed flat over the bread in her pocket. She had not eaten today, nor had she eaten much yesterday. But the bread was not for her. She was almost to the bottom of the path when she heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft, uncertain steps of someone navigating ice in the dark. These were deliberate, measured, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight, and everything to do with authority. The footsteps of someone who had never in their life needed to be careful about being heard. Lottie did not turn around. She walked faster. Caius had not intended to follow her. He had been at the window of the great hall, the wide, arched window overlooking the inner yard, holding a cup of wine he hadn't touched, watching the yard simply because it was something to look at. That wasn't the faces of his council, who had spent the last 2 hours arguing about grain taxes and border disputes, and a dozen other things that all sounded the same after a while. Outside was easier. Outside was quiet. He had seen her come out of the side door. He'd recognized her distantly. The small, thin woman who cleaned the east wing every morning before he was dressed, who moved along the walls like a shadow with a mop. He'd noticed her in the way one notices a familiar piece of furniture. Present, unremarkable, part of the background. But then he had watched her cross the yard, and he had seen the shape of her hand pressed against her apron pocket. He knew what that shape meant. He had grown up in a keep. He knew what a person looked like when they were carrying something they should not be carrying. The slight forward lean, the arm held too close to the body, the walk that was trying very hard to look like it was not a run. She had taken something from his kitchens. He set the cup down. He didn't call a guard. He didn't summon his steward. He simply pulled his cloak from the chair where he'd left it and walked out of the great hall, through the corridor, and out the side door himself. The cold was immediate and bracing. He breathed it in, rolled his shoulders once, and looked down the yard. She was already at the gate. He followed. Lottie heard the footsteps stop. She was nearly to the first row of village houses now, and she allowed herself one glance back. Just one, brief and sideways. And what she saw made the breath stop in her chest, like a fist had closed around her lungs. The man standing at the bottom of the path was not a guard. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark wool cloak that fell to his boots. His hair was black and wind-scattered, and even in the poor light of the torches at the path's entrance, she could see the quality of everything he wore. The leather of his gloves, the silver clasp at his throat, the straight, unhurried way he stood, like a man who had never once in his life been cold, or hungry, or afraid. Alpha King Caius. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the keep had seen him. But seeing him from across a great hall while sweeping stone floors was very different from standing 20 feet away from him on an empty village path at night, with stolen bread pressed against your hip. Lottie turned back around. Her legs wanted to run. Her mind told them not to. Running is worse. Running is an admission. She kept walking. Stop. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried through the cold air the way a stone carries through still water. Clean, total. Impossible to pretend you hadn't heard. Lottie stopped. She stood very still for a moment, her back to him. One hand flat over the bread in her pocket, the other curled at her side. The wind moved through the pine trees above the path. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and went quiet. Then she turned around. She met his eyes because there was nothing else left to do. Caius looked at her. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s perhaps, with a face that might have been soft in other circumstances, but was currently arranged into something carefully composed. As if composure was the one thing she had left, and she was holding it with both hands. Her hair was dark and pulled back tightly, several strands loose around her face from the wind. Her shawl was entirely inadequate for this temperature. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that he could see from where he stood. "Your pocket," he said. For a moment she didn't move. Then, with the kind of deliberate steadiness that he recognized as controlled fear, not fearlessness, but something harder, the decision to stand still inside fear, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the bread. She held it out toward him in both hands. Just that. No excuse. No explanation. No tears. Just the bread held out toward him flat-palmed, her chin up, her dark eyes steady on his face. Caius looked at the bread. Then at her. "Why?" he asked. Something flickered across her face, gone so fast he almost missed it. "I was hungry," she said. It was not the truth. He could hear it. The slight flatness of a sentence constructed rather than remembered, the way her eyes stayed too steady, as if she was concentrating on keeping them there. He had been lied to by advisors, by nobles, by men who had practiced deception their entire lives. This woman was not a good liar, but she was a determined one. "Were you?" he said, not a question. She didn't answer. The bread remained in her outstretched hands, offered back to him like a small, warm surrender. Caius looked at her hands. They were raw from cold and work, the knuckles reddened, the skin around her wrists chapped where her sleeves didn't quite reach, the hands of someone who worked every single day without exception. He looked at the crack in her boot. He looked at the shawl that was doing essentially nothing against the night air. He looked at the bread again. Then he did something that made no sense to him, even as he was doing it. "Keep it," he said. Lottie's outstretched hands didn't move. Her steady expression cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, into something that looked almost like confusion. "Keep walking," he added, "and don't let me catch you in my kitchens again." He turned and started back up the path. He had gone perhaps 10 steps when something stopped him. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one. The realization that he had not heard her footsteps resume behind him, which meant she was still standing exactly where he'd left her, bread in both hands, not moving. He did not turn back around, but he stopped walking, and then he heard it. Barely, carried down on the wind from wherever she was standing. A child's cough. Small, wet, persistent, coming from somewhere close. From one of those dark, shuttered houses at the edge of the village, the one with no smoke rising from its chimney. Caius stood very still on the icy path. He thought about the bread. The shape of her hand pressed against her apron pocket. The lie she had told him with her chin held up, and her eyes steady as stone. I was hungry. He turned around slowly. Lottie was already gone. But the house at the end of the row, the one with the cracked shutter and the dark chimney and the sound of a child coughing behind its walls, was not. Caius looked at it for a long moment. Then he followed. The door was not locked. That was the first thing Caius noticed. The door had no lock. Or rather, it had the rusted ghost of one, a broken iron latch hanging loose from the frame by a single bent nail. Anyone could walk in. Anyone could walk out. The wood itself was swollen from moisture and winter, warped at the bottom where it scraped against the stone threshold, and someone had stuffed a strip of old burlap into the gap along the side to keep the wind from coming through. It had not worked. The wind came through anyway. Caius stood outside the door for a moment. He could hear voices inside. Low, careful voices, the kind people used when they were trying not to disturb something fragile. He could hear the cough again, closer now, and beneath it, the sound of a small fire struggling to exist, the weak pop and hiss of wet wood that hadn't quite caught. He raised his fist and knocked. Silence. Not the silence of an empty house. The silence of people who had learned to go very still when someone knocked at night. "I'm not here to cause harm," he said, through the door. A long pause, then the scrape of a chair, then Lottie's voice, low and controlled, from just on the other side of the wood. "You followed me." "Yes." Another pause. "Why?" Caius considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. He heard her exhale, a short, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. Then the door opened. The inside of the house was one room. He took it in quickly, the way he took in everything. The single straw pallet against the far wall, the small stone hearth where a fire was indeed barely surviving, 2 or 3 pieces of damp wood propped over a handful of orange coals, a rough wooden table, 2 stools, a shelf with almost nothing on it, a clay cup, a small bundle of dried herbs, a candle burned nearly to the base, and on the pallet, wrapped in what appeared to be every piece of fabric the house contained, a moth-eaten wool blanket, a man's old coat, something that might once have been a curtain, a child, a boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with Lottie's dark eyes and a fever that had colored his cheeks a deep, unnatural rose. He was awake, watching Caius from the pallet with the particular wariness of a child who has learned that strangers at the door rarely mean good things. His small chest rose and fell with the effort of breathing. Every few seconds, the cough came, wet, rattling, too large for such a small body. Caius stood in the doorway and looked at the room. Then he looked at Lottie. She was standing between him and the child, not dramatically, not with her arms spread wide, just standing there, her body placed with absolute precision in the space between the door and the pallet. A wall of one. Her chin was up again, the same way it had been on the path when she'd held out the bread with steady hands. That composure again, held so carefully it almost looked like coldness, until you noticed how tightly her fingers were curled at her sides. "His name is Edmund," she said. "He is my brother. He has had the fever for 4 days." Caius said nothing. "I have given him everything I have," she continued, and her voice was level, the words chosen carefully, precisely, without any invitation for pity. Simply the facts of the situation laid out like stones. "The keep's physician lives at the north end of the village. I went to him 2 days ago. He told me he does not treat servants' families." She paused. "He told me to come back when I had coin." The fire popped. Edmund coughed. "The bread was for him," Caius said, not a question this time either. "Bread is easier to eat when your throat hurts," Lottie said simply. "And he hasn't kept much down." Caius looked at the boy on the pallet. Edmund had not looked away from him for a single moment. There was no welcome in the child's gaze, only that careful, animal watchfulness of someone very young, who has nonetheless already understood that the world is not reliably kind. Something moved in Caius's chest. He was not entirely sure what to call it. He turned back to the door. "I'll send the physician tonight." Lottie's composure broke, not into relief, but into something more complicated, a tightening around her eyes, a slight parting of her lips, as if the words had landed somewhere unexpected and tender. "He won't come," she said. "Not for—" "He will come," Caius said, and his voice had dropped into something quiet and final that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what he was. "When I send him." A silence. "Why?" Lottie asked. It was the same question he'd asked her on the path. He recognized it and almost said, "I don't know yet" again, because it would have been honest. Instead, he said, "Because the boy needs a physician." He glanced once more at Edmund, who was still watching him with those careful dark eyes. "And because your physician apparently needs reminding of what his purpose is." He stepped back from the doorway. The cold wrapped around him immediately. "Stay with your brother," he said. "Someone will come before the hour is out." Lottie stood in the open doorway and watched him walk back up the path toward the keep. She stood there until the darkness swallowed him, until there was nothing left of him but the sound of his boots on the frozen ground, and then even that faded. Edmund coughed behind her. She closed the door, gently, so the broken latch caught, and went back to kneel beside the pallet. She pressed her palm to her brother's forehead. Still burning, she dipped the rag in the clay cup, wrung it out, laid it across his brow. "Who was that man?" Edmund asked. His voice was hoarse and small. "Someone from the keep," Lottie said. "Is he going to hurt us?" She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "No," she said. And then, because Edmund was looking at her with those eyes that had always seen through everything she tried to protect him from, "I don't think so." "You don't sound sure." "I'm not," she admitted. "Go to sleep." Edmund closed his eyes. She sat beside him on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, the thin warmth of the struggling fire reaching her in small, insufficient waves. She pulled the old coat tighter around his shoulders and watched the coals. She thought about the bread, about the way Caius had looked at it in her outstretched hands, and then looked at her. Not the way the other men in the keep looked at her, dismissively, through her, as if she were part of the furniture, but directly, with a focused attention that had felt almost like pressure, like he was reading something. "Keep it," he had said. She hadn't expected that. She had expected anger, or cold indifference, or the mechanical transfer of punishment, docked wages, dismissal, possibly worse. She had been prepared for all of those things. She had not been prepared for "keep it," said in a quiet voice with his eyes on her cracked boot, and she found now that unprepared was a more dangerous state than any of the others. Dangerous because it left room for something she could not afford. Across the village, the door of the physician's house opened to a sharp knock, and a young man in the silver livery of Veldreth Keep, who delivered a message in 4 sentences. The physician, a soft man named Aldrich, who had grown comfortable in the assumption that his services flowed upward and never down, felt the color leave his face somewhere around the 2nd sentence. He arrived at Lottie's door with his bag in hand less than 20 minutes later. He did not meet her eyes when she opened it. He simply said, "I'm here for the boy," and stepped inside. Lottie stood in the doorway again after Aldrich had gone. Edmund's fever broken by morning, the physician having left medicines and instructions and a great deal of visible discomfort, and looked up toward the keep on the hill. Its torches burned in the dark. Its walls were solid and immense against the gray sky. It had always looked like a threat from down here, like something designed to remind you of your place. Tonight it looked different, and she couldn't say why. Edmund called her name softly from the pallet. She went back inside and closed the door. 3 floors above the village, Caius stood at his window with an untouched cup of wine, watching the dark cluster of houses below. He had told himself he'd stopped at the window for one moment. That had been some time ago. Somewhere in one of those houses, a physician was doing the work he should have been doing all along. And somewhere in one of those houses was a woman who had stood in a freezing doorway with stolen bread in her hands and not a word of apology on her lips. And something about that, the precise, stubborn dignity of it, had lodged itself somewhere in his chest and was refusing, with great determination, to leave. He set the cup down. This was a complication he had not anticipated. The east wing was quieter than the rest of the keep. That was why Lottie preferred it. The great hall, the council chambers, the main corridors. Those spaces were full of movement and noise and the particular kind of attention that powerful people paid to things they considered beneath them, which was its own kind of exhausting. But the east wing, with its long stone corridor and its high narrow windows that let in pale strips of morning light, was usually empty at this hour. Just her, the mop, the cold stone floor, and the sound of her own breathing. She worked methodically, the way she did everything, starting at the far end, working back toward the door, moving the mop in long, even strokes. The stone was old and dark, the kind of gray that never looked clean, no matter how much you scrubbed it, but she scrubbed it anyway. It was the 3rd morning since Edmund's fever had broken. The physician had come back twice more. Uninvited both times, she noted, which meant someone was still sending him. And each time Edmund had been a little more himself, a little more the boy who argued about everything and asked questions without end. She hadn't spoken to Caius since the night on the path. She had seen him twice, once crossing the inner yard with 2 of his advisors, once at the far end of the great hall during the evening meal that servants carried and never ate. Both times he had not looked in her direction, or if he had, she hadn't caught it. She told herself this was the natural order of things restored. A moment of unexpected mercy was not a relationship. A physician sent in the night was not a promise. The Alpha King of Veldrath had 1,000 concerns larger than a maid with a sick brother, and she would do well to remember that. She was telling herself this for approximately the 4th time that morning when she heard his footsteps. She knew them now. She hated that she knew them. Caius had not planned to walk through the east wing. His morning had a shape. Council at the 7th hour, then inspection of the northern gate where a section of wall needed assessment, then a letter to be dictated to the Ironfeld pack regarding the disputed grazing territory. He knew the shape of his mornings with great precision because precision was the thing that kept everything functioning. A keep this size, a territory this wide, an authority maintained not through cruelty, but through consistency. All of it required a man who knew exactly where he was supposed to be and when. The east wing was not in the shape of his morning. And yet here he was, walking down its long corridor at the hour when he knew it was cleaned, his hands clasped behind his back, his steps slowing as he approached the sound of the mop on stone. He rounded the corner, and she was there, back to him, working. She was wearing the same gray dress she always wore, her hair pinned up tightly, the thin shawl now replaced, he noticed, by a slightly heavier one, dark green wool, still modest, but meaningfully warmer than the previous one. He had asked his housekeeper to leave it with the East Wing supplies 3 days ago. He had told himself it was a practical matter. Cold servants worked less efficiently, that was all. She hadn't thanked him for it, because she didn't know it was from him. She thought, presumably, that someone had simply left it. He watched her work for a moment. Then she went still. She didn't turn around, but her hands stopped on the mop handle, and he knew she'd sensed him there, whatever combination of sound and instinct had told her. He'd noticed that about her. She was always aware of a room without appearing to be. A skill built from years of being someone who had to know where the danger was before it reached her. "The boy," he said. "Edmund? He's recovering?" A brief pause. "Yes." She turned then, just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "The physician says another week of rest and the medicines and he should be well." "Good." She turned back to the floor. Caius stood in the corridor. He was aware that he was standing in the East Wing corridor, watching a maid mop a floor, and that this was not a thing the Alpha King of Veldrath was supposed to be doing with his morning. And yet his feet had no particular interest in moving. "You should have come to me," he said. Her hand stopped again. "When the physician refused you," he continued, "you should have come to the keep. There are channels for—" "Channels," she repeated, and something in the word was so dry and flat and precise that it stopped him mid-sentence. She turned around fully now, looking at him with those steady eyes. "My lord, I have worked in this keep for 6 years. I know what the channels are." She paused. "The channels are for people who exist in this keep, not people who clean its floors." Caius looked at her. "You exist in this keep," he said. "I function in this keep." She corrected quietly. "Those aren't the same thing." The words landed with a simplicity that made them harder to dismiss than any accusation. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performing. She was simply stating a truth she had clearly lived for long enough that it no longer surprised her. Caius found he had nothing immediate to say to that. From the far end of the corridor, half hidden in the shadow of the stairwell, a man watched the exchange with narrow eyes. His name was Dorian. He was the keep's steward, a lean, well-dressed man of perhaps 50, with silver at his temples, and a smile that arrived slightly before it was felt. He had managed the practical affairs of Veldrath Keep for 11 years, through 2 administrations, and he had survived both by understanding one thing above all others: which way power moved, and how to stand in its path. He had been on his way to deliver a report to the council chamber when he'd seen Caius turn down the East Wing corridor. Curiosity had made him follow, quietly, and now he stood watching the Alpha King of Veldrath hold a conversation with a floor mopper about the nature of existing versus functioning. This was new. Dorian was a man who noticed new things and filed them carefully, the way a merchant files unusual coins, not because he knew their value yet, but because the day might come when he did. He watched the way Caius stood when he spoke to her, not the posture of a lord addressing a servant, something more level than that, more attentive. He watched the way the girl held herself, straight-backed, unafraid, nothing in her manner that invited the conversation, but nothing that rejected it either. He watched for another moment. Then he stepped back into the stairwell and went up to the council chamber by a different route, his expression pleasant and unreadable, his mind moving with the particular quiet efficiency of someone already thinking 3 steps ahead. That evening, Lottie was called to the housekeeper's office. Mistress Vera was a stout woman with iron-gray hair, and a manner so efficient it bordered on mechanical. She had run the domestic staff of Veldrath Keep for longer than Lottie had been alive, and she communicated entirely in flat declarative sentences that left no room for questions. "You've been reassigned," Vera said, without looking up from her ledger. "Effective tomorrow morning. You'll take over the upper corridor duties. 4th floor, West Wing." Lottie stood very still. "The upper corridor," she repeated. "The residential level. Lord Caius's private corridor included." Vera made a mark in the ledger. "The girl who had that assignment has been moved to the laundry. You'll start at the 5th hour." "Why was I reassigned?" Vera looked up then, briefly, with the expression of someone who considered the question mildly inconvenient. "I don't explain administrative decisions to floor staff," she said. "5th hour. Don't be late." Lottie walked back to the servants' quarters with the feeling of the conversation sitting uneasily in her chest. It wasn't a punishment. The upper corridor was a better assignment. Warmer floors, lighter work. But the timing of it. 3 days after the Alpha King had followed her home. 3 days after physicians started appearing unbidden at her door. She thought about Caius standing in the East Wing corridor this morning, saying you exist in this keep as if he genuinely believed it, as if saying it could make it true. She thought about Dorian, whom she had glimpsed at the far end of the corridor as she'd turned back to her work, just a shape at the edge of her vision, gone before she could look properly. She might have thought she'd imagined it, except that Lottie had spent 6 years developing the precise instinct for when she was being watched. She had not imagined it. Edmund was sitting up when she arrived home, wrapped in the old coat, eating a piece of bread with focused concentration. He looked up when she came in and said, around a mouthful, "The physician left more of the medicine. He says I'm nearly well." He swallowed. "Lottie, who keeps sending him?" She hung up her shawl, the green wool one, which she had accepted because the cold was not something she could afford to be proud about, and sat on the stool beside the fire. "I don't know," she said. Edmund looked at her with those dark, too perceptive eyes. "You do know," he said. "You just don't want to say it." Lottie looked at the fire for a long moment. "Eat your bread," she said quietly, "and don't ask questions you're not old enough for." Edmund, who was arguably old enough for most things, chose, wisely, to eat his bread. The 4th floor of the West Wing smelled like cedar wood and cold stone, and something else. Something underneath the cedar, darker and warmer, like the memory of a fire that had burned a long time ago in a room that had since gone quiet. Lottie noticed it on the first morning. She noticed most things, but smells in particular. They told you things about a space that the visible surfaces didn't. The East Wing had smelled like damp and disuse. The kitchen smelled like grease and urgency. This corridor smelled like a place where someone actually lived, which was different from a place someone merely occupied. She worked quietly, the way she always worked. The corridor was long, with high ceilings and thick rugs that absorbed the sound of her steps, and the windows at each end let in the pale early light of a winter morning, still deciding whether to arrive fully or go back to bed. The doors along the corridor were all closed. She cleaned around them, swept the rugs, wiped the stone sills, polished the iron wall sconces until the metal caught what little light there was. She had been there perhaps an hour when the door at the far end opened. Caius came out wearing a plain dark tunic, no cloak, his hair not yet fully ordered from sleep. He was carrying a document he appeared to be reading as he walked, which was how he nearly stepped directly into her bucket. He stopped, looked down at the bucket, then at her. "You're early," he said. "5th hour," she said. As instructed. He looked at the document, then at the corridor, as if recalibrating his understanding of the morning. "I forgot Vera had made the change," he said, which was either the truth or a very good approximation of it. "I can work from the other end," she offered. "If you prefer to have the corridor to yourself at this hour, that's not necessary." He stepped around the bucket with the easy, unconscious grace of someone whose body moved through space without effort, and continued down the corridor, reading his document. He stopped at the window at the far end, stood there reading in the pale light, the document held in one hand. She returned to her work. For a while there was only the sound of the cloth on stone, and the wind outside the windows, and the occasional turn of a page. It should have been uncomfortable. It was. She realized with some unease, not uncomfortable at all. It had the quality of two people who had simply agreed, without discussing it, to share a space without demanding anything of each other. She didn't know what to do with that. "You've worked here 6 years," he said, without looking up from the document. "Yes." "Since you were 22, she said. A pause. "And before that?" She ran the cloth along the windowsill. Outside, the village was still dark, just the first gray suggestion of morning at the edge of the sky. "Before that, I was in the Valley settlement. Fenwick. My parents died when I was 19. Edmund was 3. She kept her voice even, factual, the way she'd learned to talk about things that had once been very large and had since had to be made smaller in order to be carried. There was nothing left in Fenwick. So I came here. Caius lowered the document. He was looking at her now, and she was aware of it without looking back. "Alone," he said. With a 3-year-old. He was very portable at that age, she said. A silence. Then, and she did not expect it, would not have predicted it from a man who seemed constructed primarily of authority and quiet control. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Brief. Low. Like something that had escaped before he'd decided to let it out. She looked at him. He was looking at the document again, but the corner of his mouth had shifted slightly. Something in her chest did a thing she immediately told it to stop doing. She told herself, walking home that evening through the cold, that it meant nothing. Men in power were occasionally human. That was not new information. Caius had shown her an unexpected consideration, and she had, for a moment, allowed herself to be warmed by it, which was the natural response of a person who had been cold for a long time. That was all it was. She was warm near a fire, cold away from it. The fire did not belong to her. Edmund was at the table when she arrived, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing something on a flat piece of wood that he'd found somewhere. He looked up. His color was almost normal now, the roses of fever replaced by the ordinary rosy cold of a child who had spent part of the afternoon near an open window. "You're late," he said. "I had additional duties." She hung up her shawl and came to look at what he was drawing. It was a rough sketch of the keep, surprisingly detailed for a child. The towers, the outer wall, the gates. "When did you learn to do that?" "I've been drawing it every day while you're gone," he said. "I can see it from the window." He paused. "Lottie, is the Alpha King the one who's been sending the physician?" She sat down across from him. "What makes you ask that?" "Because the physician calls him my lord when he talks to himself," Edmund said, with the absolute composure of a child reporting observable facts. "He thinks I'm asleep," he mutters. He said, "My lord's instructions are clear, 3 times yesterday." Lottie looked at her brother for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I think so." Edmund looked back at his drawing. "Why?" "I don't know." "Do you think he's a good person?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire, better stocked these days since she'd been able to buy a small bundle of dry wood with her wages, burned steadily in the hearth. "I think," she said carefully, "that he is a more complicated person than I expected him to be." Edmund seemed to find this satisfactory. He went back to drawing. Dorian moved through the keep with his usual unhurried efficiency, which was the manner of a man who had learned that urgency was a visible thing and visibility was a vulnerability. He had spent the last several days gathering information in the way he always gathered it, not by asking questions, which drew attention, but by being present in the right places and listening to the ambient noise of a keep that contained 300 people and could keep no secret for long. What he had gathered was this. The Alpha King, who had in 11 years of Dorian's service shown precisely no personal interest in any member of the domestic staff, had followed a floor maid home in the dark, sent a physician to her dying brother, reassigned her to the residential level corridor, and had been seen standing at a window with her for an extended period that morning, having what multiple servants who passed the corridor described as a conversation. A conversation. Not an instruction. Not a reprimand. A conversation. With a maid who swept floors. Dorian considered this in the privacy of his office, his fingers steepled, his expression pleasantly neutral. He was not alarmed. Not yet. Alarm was premature. What he felt was the careful attention of a man who had built a great deal of influence on the understanding that Caius was predictable, driven by duty, by pack law, by the unbroken logic of what was expected of an Alpha King. Alliances were built on that predictability. Arrangements had been made. There was a noble family to the east, the Heron line, with a daughter of appropriate standing and a considerable territory that would strengthen Veldrath's borders considerably. Discussions had been in progress for 2 years. Dorian had been the quiet architect of those discussions. None of that architecture accommodated a maid from the East Wing. He uncapped his ink and began to write a letter. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider from the east. Caius read it in his study, standing at his desk, still in his riding clothes from the morning inspection of the northern wall. It was from Lord Heron, formal, precisely worded, suggesting that a meeting to advance the previously discussed arrangement would be welcomed at Veldrath's convenience. The letter contained, in its third paragraph, a sentence about the importance of appropriate union for the stability of northern pacts, which was diplomatic language for a sentiment that required no translation. He set the letter down. He thought, with no particular logic connecting the two things, about the East Wing corridor that morning. About the way Lottie had said he was very portable at that age with such absolute dryness that the humor of it had arrived 3 full seconds after the words, and he'd found himself doing something in a corridor that he could not recall doing in recent memory. He thought about the Heron letter. He thought about Dorian, who had placed the letter personally on his desk, with a small, satisfied smile, and the words, "Good timing on all fronts, my lord." Caius picked up the letter again, read it through once more, set it face down on the desk. He walked to the window, the one that looked east, toward the village, toward the scatter of low timber houses at the bottom of the hill. He stood there for a long time. Lottie was almost at the keep's gate the following morning when she heard her name. Not spoken by Caius, spoken by a woman she didn't recognize. Tall, fair-haired, dressed in traveling clothes of deep burgundy wool, standing near a carriage that had arrived in the outer yard sometime in the night. The woman was perhaps 35, elegant and sharp-featured, with the particular bearing of someone who had grown up being looked at. Behind her, 2 attendants, and standing near the keep's main doors, watching the yard with his usual pleasant expression. Dorian. "You're the maid," the woman said, looking at Lottie with calm, assessing eyes. "The one from the East Wing." A pause. "And now the West Wing, I understand." Lottie looked at her steadily. "I work in the keep, yes." The woman smiled. It was a precise, practiced smile, the kind that conveyed warmth without containing any. "My name is Lady Seraphine Heron," she said. "I've come to visit Lord Caius." Another pause, smaller this time, timed beautifully. "We have a great deal to discuss." She walked past Lottie into the keep. Dorian caught Lottie's eye as he followed. His expression was still pleasant, still unreadable. Just, for a single moment, attentive. Lottie stood in the cold yard, the wind moving through her green wool shawl, and understood with complete clarity that the shape of things had just shifted in some way she had not been prepared for. She picked up her bucket and went to work. Lady Seraphine Heron moved through Veldrath Keep like she already owned it. Lottie observed this from the edges. From the corridor, from the doorway, from the particular invisibility that 6 years of domestic work had perfected into an art form. Seraphine walked with her chin at an angle that suggested every room she entered had been arranged for her benefit. She spoke to the staff in the pleasant, clipped tones of someone who had learned to address servants as a courtesy, rather than a necessity. She laughed at the right moments during meals. She wore different clothes for morning and evening, each set impeccable, each color chosen with the instinct of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of argument. She was, by every visible measure, exactly what an Alpha King's consort was supposed to look like. Dorian accompanied her at nearly every public moment, which told Lottie everything she needed to know about whose idea this visit had been. Caius was civil, attentive in the way duty required. He sat across from Seraphine at the evening meal and answered her questions and listened to her observations about the northern territories with the focused patience of a man doing the work he was born to do. Lottie, carrying a water pitcher along the side of the great hall, watched his face during one of these exchanges. Not the face he showed Seraphine, which was courteous and composed, but the face in the half-second before he arranged it, when he thought no one was looking. It was the face of a man doing something that felt correct and hollow at the same time. She looked away before he could catch her watching. On the 3rd day of Seraphine's visit, Edmund came to the keep. This was not supposed to happen. Lottie had told him, with great clarity, that the keep was her place of work, and not a place for small boys to wander. and Edmund had agreed with the cooperative expression he used when he had already decided to do the opposite. She found him in the outer yard, standing near the stables, looking up at the keep's towers with the same focused attention he gave his charcoal drawings. He had his piece of wood with him, tucked under his arm, and when she found him and took him firmly by the shoulder, he looked up at her without guilt. "I wanted to see it properly," he said. "You've seen it. Now come." "He's behind you," Edmund said. She turned. Caius was crossing the yard from the direction of the stables, clearly returning from a morning ride, his dark cloak dusty from the road. He stopped when he saw them. His eyes went from Lottie to Edmund, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a small softening, like frost beginning to consider spring. Edmund looked at him with the complete fearlessness of a child who has decided on instinct that a person is safe. "You're the Alpha King," he said. "I am," Caius said. "You sent the physician." A brief pause. Caius glanced at Lottie, who was currently having a conversation with herself about how deeply she regretted every decision that had led to this moment. "Yes," he said. Edmund considered this with great seriousness. Then he held out the piece of wood. "I drew your keep," he said. "You can have it if you want." Caius looked at the drawing, the careful charcoal lines, the towers rendered with the particular intensity of a child who had spent days looking at something and learning its shape. He crouched down to take it properly, at Edmund's level, which was not a thing Lottie had expected, and which did something to her chest that she was entirely unprepared for. "Thank you," Caius said. "It's well done." "I'm going to be an architect," Edmund said, "when I'm grown." "Then Veldrath may need your services," Caius said seriously. "The North Tower has needed rebuilding for 15 years. Edmund's face lit up with the pure, uncomplicated joy of being taken seriously. Dorian saw the exchange from the upper window. Beside him, Seraphine stood with her hands folded, her expression still pleasant, but her eyes had sharpened into something no longer decorative. "How long has this been happening?" she said. It was not a question. "It is nothing of consequence," Dorian said, which was the first outright lie he had told her, and he told it smoothly, from long practice. Seraphine turned from the window. "My father did not send me here to be nothing of consequence, Dorian." "And you won't be," he said. "There is a formal dinner tonight. The council will be present. I have arranged for certain conversations to take place that will make the practical advantages of an alliance with Heron very clear to those whose opinions matter. By tomorrow, the Alpha King will have his council's unified recommendation." Seraphine looked at him for a moment. "And the maid?" "Will be reassigned back to the East Wing in the morning," Dorian said smoothly. "An administrative correction. Nothing more." She looked back out the window. Below, Caius was standing again, saying something to Lottie that Dorian couldn't hear. Edmund had retreated to the stable wall to draw something new. "See that it's done tonight," Seraphine said. The formal dinner was loud and warm, and full of exactly the kind of conversation that made the walls of the great hall feel closer than they were. Lottie was not at the dinner. She was in the corridor outside it, collecting empty pitchers and returning full ones to the kitchen, moving through the half-darkness with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She could hear the voices through the doors. The council's deep tones, Seraphine's measured laughter, Dorian's smooth facilitations. She was on her 3rd trip back from the kitchen when she heard 2 of the council members talking in the side corridor. They were not whispering. Men with authority rarely bothered to. "Heron territory would double our eastern border security," one of them was saying. "Dorian's been building toward this for 2 years," the other replied. "The timing is deliberate. The girl is a complication he's moving to remove. Efficiently, it seems. She'll be gone from the residential level by morning." A pause. The sound of boots on stone, moving away. Lottie stood very still in the corridor with a water pitcher in each hand. The girl is a complication he's moving to remove. She had known this. She had known it the moment Seraphine had walked through the yard with that precise smile and that perfectly timed pause. She had known it, and she had kept working because what else did you do with a thing you knew and couldn't change? But hearing it spoken in a corridor, casually, like an administrative note, "She'll be gone from the residential level by morning," made it real in a different way. Made her something in a ledger, a variable to be corrected. The kind of thing that Dorian filed and managed and quietly eliminated. She set the pictures down on the stone floor. She stood there for a moment, alone in the dark corridor, and felt the full, specific weight of being someone who existed in the margins of other people's plans. Then she picked the pictures back up and went back to work. Because that was what you did. Caius left the dinner early. Not dramatically. He simply reached the point at which the conversation had become a repetition of itself, and excused himself with the brevity of a man in his own home who required no further justification. He walked through the corridor toward his study, nodding once to the guard at the stair. He found Dorian waiting outside his study door. "My lord." Dorian's expression was pleasant and prepared. "A word, if you have a moment." "Briefly," Caius said, and opened the door. Inside, Dorian laid it out with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it. The Heron Alliance, the Council's recommendation, the strategic value, the timing. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes without pause, and everything he said was logical and well-structured and completely reasonable by every measure that applied to an Alpha King's decisions. Then he said, "There is also the matter of the domestic reassignment. The maid, Lottie, currently on the residential level. I've arranged for her return to the East Wing, effective tomorrow. Given the current circumstances, her presence on the 4th floor is an unnecessary." "Why?" Caius said. Dorian paused. "My lord?" "Why is it unnecessary?" A brief recalibration behind Dorian's pleasant eyes. "Propriety," he said smoothly. "With Lady Seraphine in residence and discussions at this stage, it is simply tidier to—" "You've been managing this," Caius said. Not loudly, quietly, which was worse. The Heron correspondence, the timing of the visit, the reassignment. "I've been facilitating what is in Veldrath's best interest," Dorian said, "as I have always done." "You've been building an outcome," Caius said, "and removing anything that didn't fit it." He looked at Dorian for a long moment, and Dorian, who had survived 2 administrations and moved through power like water through stone, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt the specific discomfort of being genuinely seen. "The physician," Caius said. "Did you delay him? The first time she went to him?" A silence that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "Aldrich makes his own decisions about his schedule," Dorian said carefully. "Aldrich does what he's told," Caius said, "by whoever tells him most convincingly." He held Dorian's gaze. "You knew she'd gone to him. You knew he'd refused her, and you said nothing. A servant's domestic situation is not—" "She almost lost her brother," Caius said. The quiet in his voice had gone very still now, the stillness of deep water rather than shallow. "While you were calculating timelines and managing outcomes, a child nearly died because you decided a maid's problem was not worth interrupting your arrangements." Dorian stood very straight. "I have served this keep faithfully for 11 years. "You've served your influence faithfully for 11 years, Caius said. "Those aren't the same thing." He moved to his desk, picked up the Heron letter, held it for a moment, set it back down. "The dinner tonight. You arranged the council's recommendation. The council made their own. Dorian." A pause. "Yes," Dorian said finally. "I facilitated it." "You're relieved of the steward position," Caius said. "Effective tonight. You'll be given appropriate provision for your years of service, and you'll leave Veldrath in the morning." He looked at him once more. "That is more than you arranged for a woman with a sick child and a cracked boot." Dorian opened his mouth. Closed it. Something moved across his face. Not quite remorse, not quite anger. Something more complicated and less resolved. He inclined his head, precisely, once. Then he walked out of the study and closed the door behind him without a sound. Lottie was in the corridor outside the great hall, stacking the last of the empty pitchers, when she heard her name. She turned. Caius was standing at the end of the corridor. He had clearly come directly from somewhere. His expression carried the particular clarity of a decision recently made. He walked toward her, and she stood still and waited, because she had learned that waiting was the most honest response to things she didn't yet understand. He stopped a few feet from her, looked at her, that direct reading attention she had first felt on the icy path. "I know about the reassignment," he said. "It's been canceled." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Lady Seraphine is a political arrangement I was never asked about," he said. "That Dorian built and assumed I would step into." He paused. "I'm not stepping into it." Lottie held very still. Outside, the wind moved against the keep's stones, the old familiar sound of winter insisting on itself. "My lord," she said carefully, "I'm a maid. You're the person who walked down an icy hill in a broken boot to bring a sick child warm bread," he said, and stood in a frozen doorway and held it out to me without one word of apology. He looked at her steadily. "That is not nothing. That has not been nothing to me for weeks." She felt something give way in her chest, not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet structural shift of a wall that had been standing for a very long time finally deciding it no longer needed to. "Edmund wants to rebuild your north tower," she said. The corner of his mouth shifted. "I know. I'm considering the proposal." She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was cold and quiet, and lit by 2 wall sconces that turned everything amber, and 6 years of invisible, careful, necessary smallness sat in Lottie's chest, and waited to see what she would do with what was being offered. She took a breath. "The bread was for him," she said. "But I was hungry too." It was the truth this time. He heard it the same way she'd heard his, clean and whole, the sound of something finally said correctly. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't have to be hungry here." Epilogue. Spring came to Veldrath the way it always did. Without announcement, without ceremony, just the slow insistence of warmth returning to stone that had been cold for months. The North Tower was still standing, mostly, though Edmund had produced 17 detailed drawings of what it could become, and had taken to delivering them to Caius's study with the confidence of a boy who had been told once that his ideas were worth considering, and had decided to take that at its absolute fullest value. Caius reviewed each one with genuine attention, which Edmund found entirely appropriate, and Lottie found quietly extraordinary. Dorian left Veldrath on a gray February morning, his years of provision packed into a modest carriage. He did not look back at the keep as he left.